Clemens and this is
Stephan. Hi.
Hi. Today we are talking about the history of Altmetrics. Altmetrics currently is considered a hot issue. It's debated among science politicians, funders and scholars, of course. But the question arises, is it really that new, Stephan?
That always depends on the time frame that you want to look at. For instance, if you look at the history of webometrics, not the history of Altmetrics, but the history of webometrics, that roughly begins in the 1900s or the 1960s. There's two big stories how webometrics emerged. So in comparison to that, it's actually very new. It's a quite recent phenomenon. Yet there are still other things like, for instance, cybermetrics or webometrics, which have been around roughly around the end of the 90s till today. And to understand this kind of phenomenon, we have to understand more about the logic of things like information science, evaluation, which always is triggered by new information channels. So if there's a new information channel, like for instance, if you imagine there's a human brain interface, information scientists will start to think about, well, does this have an impact on scholarly communication? And that's exactly the same with social media. For instance, if we think back, Facebook, which was founded in 2004, Twitter, which was founded around, I think, 2006. Let's say 2009 with plus article level metrics, or 2011, 2012 when Altmetrics.com and Plum Analytics at that time was funded. So if you think about that history, we could go back to around 2010, 2011, 2012-ish. You think back about cybermetrics or webometrics, and if you would compare it to Altmetrics, you would see that there seems to be a general structure how these kind of things unfold. So first of all,
what's the mechanisms, the process?
Well, the mechanism or the process, or let's say the drifts. There's kind of drifts when something like that emerges, and from what I can see, it's basically around 4 or 5 of them. The first one is always a drift that you see something new. For instance, when the World Wide Web emerged, there was a huge amount of expectations towards that. There was a talk about, oh well, now we can make science visible, we can look into what's actually going on in science, which is actually an idea that came from science studies, interestingly.
Okay.
And that's the same with Altmetrics. Just like I said, there's the World Wide Web coming up, you have cybermetrics, there's social media and well, the news was there before, but social media around this like 2006-ish kind of time. You have a similarity in that, like that is the starting point. So first of all, it's seeing something new. There's something new, and somehow information scientists and evaluators will have a look at that. The next, what usually happens, or at least it happens with cybermetrics, as same as with Altmetrics, is that you start to translate the old into the new. For instance, when cybermetrics came up, and we all know about the impact factor, and then when cybermetrics came up, there was a web impact factor.
Okay.
Or when similar with, before we had citations with a Z, and then we have citations with an S. So everybody was trying to somehow translate what was already there into something new, even though there's new issues about that, like for instance persistence of data. If you look at those databases that has been used in webometrics, there's usually some logic of cover to cover. So there's a journal, and they take everything that's in the journal, like letters, letter to the editor, notice, articles, reviews, and you put it into a large database. With the World Wide Web, that's a little bit different, because with World Wide Web, it's a little bit more liquid. There's the Wayback Machine, like archive.org, where you can always look at earlier stages of a site. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. But in general, there's a difference in coverage. Of course, articles can be retracted, but beside that issue, articles are a relatively stable phenomenon. So they have been published and then they're there. And with websites and with social media posts, just the same. They can just go away. You can delete them, or you can somehow something gets restructured and everything is gone. So there's an issue that biometricians were not able to cope with that well in the beginning. Or at least there was a discussion, because it was something very, very different. Where people say, oh, the data is not persisting, it's going away. Oh, how are we going to deal with that? So that's basically that second drift. Translating the old into the new is also the translating the old issues into the new and the questions into the new. The next thing, and that's probably kind of where we are right now with Altmetrics, is a part that's also in a way backward looking, and that is negotiating that new kind of metric against the old. And interesting, there's a little bit of a difference, because what I would say today is that that the current state of discussion is that altmetrics are considered complementary. So even though the name is alternative metrics to some, so there's a traditional metrics and there's the alternative metrics, but in that case it's more, I think most people would say, yeah, well, that's complementary in a way. With cybermetrics that was a little bit different. With cybermetrics it was really the idea that these kind of metrics would replace the traditional metrics completely, which didn't happen in a way. So that's stage 3. So you start negotiating what these metrics actually mean in the context of what's already there. And the next stage, and that's probably where we are moving towards at the moment. So I think we're currently exactly at the watershed between this stage or drift 3 and 4, and that is on the one hand programmatic stabilization. So you start to build frameworks around that. So there's talk about putting it all into a larger context or into products or anything like that. And the second one is understanding the mechanisms. That's something that happened quite similarly in cybermetrics, as well as it happens now in altmetrics, is the idea that people have to move beyond the numbers. So there's the general, well, let's put it like that, the emergence of a user-based perspective or a content perspective. So it's to say, yeah, well, numbers are fine, and I hear that a lot actually when I talk to people. So, well, the numbers are fine, but that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in what is behind the content, so what is actually being counted. And there is numerous examples for that. For instance, there's one paper that has enormously high altmetric score, which is, the point is that for some people the qualitative content, so that what is behind, what is actually the issue that is being counted, is more important and even more interesting than the metric itself.
Okay. Because
the metric itself, if we're honest, even the big papers, it moves very, very fast. It's a strength, it's also a little bit of a weakness, but it moves very, very fast. So if you think about the average paper, if it gets any attention at all, it gets it right in the beginning, then something happens. The next day maybe something happens, and then it's sort of a flutter echo, maybe starts to go lower and lower, and then nothing happens at all. With some papers, and then maybe they get a second peak, but it's always this structure like peak and then something, and then it's gone. Okay. And that's always like a month. And that in a way puts a little bit of attention on the researcher, because if the metric is not moving really, it gets maybe a little bit uninteresting unless there's some kind of evaluative framework that pushes, that puts pressure on maximizing this metric in a way. So basically that's the stage where it starts to go beyond, let's say beyond the numbers and back, and then it starts to go back and forth and understanding the content, understanding the users, and the users not necessarily people or researchers thinking about the motivations of researchers to put something on the social web. That's one point, but that's more scholarly communication, social media studies. But with altmetrics it's rather, so why are people actually looking at that? So why are people mentioning it? There's obvious reasons, like there is the, for instance, colleagues or researcher himself or herself, institutional kind of accounts putting that out, publishers can put that out, could be users, could be average Joes, mixed bag, but we don't really know.
Yes.
So, and that's something that I think we're currently moving towards in a way. And if you compare that, maybe one more thing, if we compare the time frames, as I've said before, time frames are important in that
Yes.
question.
Okay.
If you look at getting through these 4 drifts with cybermetrics, so from World Wide Web to frameworkish kind of thinking and kind of thinking about the user and content perspective, it was roughly around 10-12 years. And with Altmetrics, it's not necessarily half of it, but it's substantially less. At the same time, the pressure is much higher because there's this narrative of societal impact. And if we think about all the kind of policy making around that, the thinking about impact and the necessity to get something out there and public understanding of science and humanities in a way, that somehow seems to push that whole kind of altmetrics stronger into a certain direction, into establishment. Maybe, and there's some people are criticizing that, I think, maybe that's too early. Some people say, well, go for it. That's a tricky question. That's a tricky question. Thank you for watching. We see you next time where we'll be talking about, I think, current issue in altmetrics. See you until then. Bye bye.